On the morning of August 10, 1987, a 30-year-old woman named Janice Christensen left her home in Hudson Township, Ohio, and drove to a bike path to spend part of her day outdoors, the way countless people do on an ordinary summer morning. She never came home. When her body was found the next day, she had been attacked and killed. And beside her, investigators found a small, strange clue, a pair of shoelaces that did not belong to her. Her car and her keys were gone, the car later abandoned miles away. For nearly 4 decades, that is where the case of Janice Christensen sat. A phantom killer, a set of shoelaces, a stolen car, and no answer at all. But the clue that would finally solve Janice's murder had actually surfaced 2 months before she died, in a different crime, in a different town. In June of 1987, a 17-year-old girl, walking alone through a park, was grabbed by a man with a knife. He bound her hands and her ankles with shoelaces, and he assaulted her. And then something happened that changes this entire story. She survived. She lived. And she did something that would matter more than she could possibly have known at the time. She reported what had happened to her, and the evidence from her case was collected and preserved. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where a survivor's courage reaches across decades to deliver justice for someone else, subscribe to Decades Cold and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. For 35 years, both cases stayed cold. But in 2022, the evidence preserved from that teenager's assault was finally retested with modern DNA technology and run through CODIS, the National Criminal Database. And it produced a name. The DNA matched a career criminal, a man with a long and violent record, named Thomas Collier Jordan. The same man, investigators would confirm, who had murdered Janice Christensen. There was just one problem. Thomas Jordan had died in 2009, in Arizona, more than a decade earlier. So how do you prove, beyond any doubt, that a dead man is a killer? How do you close a 37-year-old murder against someone who's already in the ground? The answer is that investigators did something extraordinary. They traveled to the cemetery in Arizona where Jordan was buried, and they dug him up. This is the story of Janice Christensen, the teenager whose survival reached across the decades to solve a murder, and the grave that investigators opened to prove the truth. I want to slow down and speak about Janice Christensen, because the public record of a case like this can flatten a person into the circumstances of her death, and Janice was a living, 30-year-old woman with a whole life around her. She was 30 years old, and she lived in Hudson Township, in the northeastern part of Ohio, not far from Akron and Cleveland. And what we know of that last morning tells us something simple and human about her. On August 10, 1987, she left her home to go to a bike path, the Metro bike path in Hudson Township, to be outdoors. That's a small, ordinary, healthy choice, the kind of thing a person does on a summer day without a second thought. Go for a walk, get some exercise, spend an hour in the fresh air of a park. It's the most innocent way imaginable to start a day. And it's the reason I always return to the ordinariness of these lives. Because the ordinariness is exactly what makes the loss so brutal. Janice did nothing unusual, nothing risky, nothing that invited harm. She went to a public park on a summer morning. That should be one of the safest things a person can do. She had people who loved her, a family and a community who reported her missing when she didn't return, who searched for answers, and who then waited. And I want you to hold the length of that wait in your mind, because it's staggering. The people who loved Janice Christensen waited 37 years to find out who took her, nearly 4 decades. Children who knew her grew up and had children of their own. A whole generation passed. And through all of it, the question of who killed Janice went unanswered, an open wound that simply would not close. When we talk on this channel about the cost of a cold case, this is what we mean, not an abstraction, but real people carrying a specific, unresolved grief across the entire span of their lives. This is the story of how, at last, that wait ended. Here is what investigators were able to piece together about August 10, 1987. Janice left her home that morning and drove to the Metro bike path in Hudson Township, and then she vanished. When she did not return home, she was reported missing, and a search began. It ended the following morning, August 11th, with the worst possible discovery. Janice's body was found. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had been stabbed. I'm going to state that once, plainly, and leave the details alone, because they serve nothing, and Janice deserves better than to be reduced to the manner of her death. She was 30 years old, and she was killed at a public park in the middle of an ordinary day. But there were two details at that scene that mattered enormously for what came later, and I want to flag them, because they became the thread that eventually unraveled everything. The first is the shoelaces. Next to Janice's body, investigators found a pair of shoelaces that did not belong to her. Loose shoelaces, at a murder scene, that aren't the victim's. That's the kind of odd, specific detail that goes into a file and sits there, meaningless on its own, waiting for context. The second detail, Janice's car and her car keys were missing. The killer had taken them. Her vehicle was later found abandoned, some distance away, in Bedford, Ohio, about a week later. So the picture was this: a woman attacked and killed at a park, a set of shoelaces that weren't hers left behind, and her car stolen and dumped. Odd pieces, a distinct pattern, if only there were something to compare it to. And in 1987, the most important evidence of all was collected but could not yet be used, because in the course of the attack, Janice's killer had left biological evidence, his DNA. It was recovered and preserved, but this was 1987. There was no DNA database to search, and the technology to fully exploit a sample like that was still years away. So investigators had the killer's genetic identity and no way on earth to attach it to a name. The case went cold, and it stayed cold, carrying its odd little details, the shoelaces, the stolen car, into the dark, for decades. For year after year, the murder of Janice Christensen was one of those cases that haunts a police department. A killing at a public park, in daylight range, of a woman doing nothing but enjoying a summer morning, with a preserved DNA profile of the killer and absolutely no way to identify him. Think about the particular frustration of that. In many cold cases, the problem is a lack of evidence. Here, the problem was the opposite. Investigators had the single most powerful piece of evidence there is, the killer's own DNA, and it was, for practical purposes, useless. It was a locked door with no key. Until the national DNA database matured, and until the science advanced enough to fully read and compare a decades-old sample, that genetic profile was just a string of markers describing a man who could be anyone, anywhere. Every year that passed, the trail got colder. Witnesses' memories faded. Investigators retired. The killer, whoever he was, went on living his life, presumably confident that a crime committed in 1987, with no witnesses and no obvious connection to him, would never come back to touch him. And the odd details, the shoelaces, the stolen and abandoned car, sat in the file, a signature with nothing to match against. A signature is only useful if you have two things to compare. One crime, on its own, is just a crime. But a killer who does the same specific, unusual things across more than one crime, that's a pattern, and patterns can be traced. What investigators didn't yet realize, what wouldn't come into focus for decades, was that Janice's killer had left that exact signature somewhere else, 2 months earlier, on a victim who had lived to tell about it. I want to turn now to another crime, one that happened 2 months before Janice Christensen was murdered, and I want to handle it with real care, because it involves a survivor of sexual assault who was, at the time, a teenager. So I'm going to tell you what matters for the case and no more than that, and I'm going to keep the focus where it belongs, on her courage. On June 16, 1987, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, a different community in the same county, a 17-year-old girl was walking alone on a trail in a park, and a man armed with a knife attacked her. He bound her, hand and foot, with shoelaces, and he sexually assaulted her. I'm going to leave the details there. What I want you to focus on is what happened next, because it is the quiet heart of this entire story. She survived. And in the aftermath of a terrifying, violating attack, this teenager did something that took enormous courage. She came forward. She reported what had happened to her. She allowed evidence to be collected, and that evidence was preserved. I cannot overstate how much that matters, or how hard it can be. We know from decades of painful experience that sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes there is, that survivors, especially young ones, often carry their trauma in silence, out of fear or shame, or the terrible, misplaced sense that they somehow won't be believed. This young woman, at 17, in 1987, found the strength to report and to let investigators take what they needed. At the time, it didn't lead to an arrest. Her case, like Janice's, went cold, and she had to live with that, knowing her attacker was out there, unidentified, unpunished. But the evidence she made possible did not disappear. It waited, in storage, carrying the killer's DNA for a technology that did not yet exist. Her courage in 1987 became, 35 years later, the key that unlocked not only her own case, but a murder. She could not have known that. She simply did the brave and difficult thing in front of her, and because she did, a killer was finally named. Now, let's put the two crimes side by side, the way investigators eventually would, because the connection between them is chilling in its specificity. In June of 1987, a 17-year-old girl in Cuyahoga Falls is attacked by a man with a knife, and he binds her hands and ankles with shoelaces. 2 months later, in August of 1987, Janice Christensen is murdered in Hudson Township, and a pair of shoelaces that aren't hers is found beside her body. Shoelaces. In both cases, as a means of restraint or left at the scene, an unusual, distinctive detail appearing in two separate attacks, 2 months and a few miles apart. And there's more. In the assault on the teenager, the attacker took her car and her car keys. In Janice's murder, the killer took her car and her car keys. The same specific behaviors, the shoelaces, the stolen vehicle, repeated across both crimes. This is what criminal investigators call a signature, not just the practical elements of a crime, but the particular, often unnecessary things an offender does the same way each time, almost like a fingerprint of behavior. Shoelaces as restraints, taking the victim's car, attacking women alone in parks. 2 crimes, 1 signature, 1 man. But here's the crucial thing, and it's the tragedy of so many cold cases. Recognizing a signature requires connecting the cases in the first place. In 1987, these were 2 separate investigations, one a rape, one a murder, in 2 different jurisdictions, handled by different investigators, with no obvious reason to link them. The signature was there, hiding in plain sight across 2 case files that no one had put next to each other. And it would take the one piece of evidence that doesn't rely on anyone noticing a pattern, the DNA, to finally prove what the shoelaces had been quietly saying all along. The same man did both. The breakthrough came in 2022. Investigators with Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the BCI, took the DNA evidence that had been preserved from the 1987 assault of the teenager in Cuyahoga Falls, and they resubmitted it to the laboratory for retesting with modern DNA technology. The advances since 1987 were enormous. Techniques that could develop a full, clean genetic profile from a decades-old sample that the original investigators could never have fully used. And once they had that profile, they did the thing that had been impossible in 1987. They entered it into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, the national database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. And this time, the database had an answer. The profile matched a known offender. His name was Thomas Collier Jordan. He had been born in Cleveland in 1926. And when investigators pulled his history, they understood immediately that they were looking at exactly the kind of man capable of these crimes. Jordan had a long, violent criminal record stretching back decades, an extensive history that included convictions for burglary and, most tellingly, a 1976 conviction for rape, stabbing, and burglary, for which he had been imprisoned until 1985. Read that timeline carefully. Thomas Jordan was released from prison in 1985 after serving time for a violent sexual attack involving a knife. And 2 years later, in 1987, a 17-year-old was raped at knife point and a woman was stabbed to death, both in the same Ohio county. The CODIS hit didn't just produce a name. It produced a name that fit the crimes like a key fits a lock. This is the power of the database that this channel returns to again and again. Not the family tree genealogy we've covered so often, but the older, more direct workhorse, CODIS, quietly holding millions of offender profiles, waiting for the day a retested sample from an old crime finally has something to match against. For Janice Christensen's case, and for the survivors, that day was in 2022, 35 years after the attacks. The Phantom finally had a name. There was only one obstacle left, and it was a big one. The obstacle was this: Thomas Collier Jordan was dead. He had died in 2009 in Yuma, Arizona, at the age of 83. By the time his DNA profile surfaced in CODIS as the match, the man himself had been in the ground for more than a decade. Now, you might think a database match is the end of the story. The DNA said Jordan, so the case is closed. But it isn't quite that simple, and the care investigators took here is worth understanding. A CODIS hit is powerful, but responsible investigators want to confirm it directly, especially before publicly declaring a specific person the killer in a murder case. A person who, being dead, cannot defend himself. The gold standard is to compare the crime scene DNA against a fresh, confirmed sample from the suspect himself, or, failing that, from a close biological relative whose DNA can verify the family match. So that's what investigators tried to do first. They searched for a living relative of Thomas Jordan, someone whose DNA they could test to confirm the connection, and they came up empty. For whatever reason, they could not locate a suitable living family member to provide that confirmatory sample. Think about the position that puts them in. They have a CODIS match to a dead man. They have a murder and an assault they believe he committed. They have a moral obligation to the victims' families to be certain, and an equal obligation not to brand a dead man a killer on anything less than rock-solid proof. The suspect is beyond questioning, beyond arrest, beyond a courtroom, and there's no living relative to test. Under those circumstances, most investigations would simply have to settle for a strong but unconfirmed database hit. But the BCI decided that wasn't good enough. They wanted certainty. And to get it, there was only one place left to go for Thomas Jordan's DNA, to Thomas Jordan himself, wherever he lay. In April of 2024, agents from Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation traveled roughly 2,000 miles, from Ohio to Yuma, Arizona, to the cemetery where Thomas Collier Jordan was buried. And they exhumed his body. They opened his grave, recovered what they needed, and obtained a direct DNA sample from the remains of the man himself. I want to let the sheer determination of that sink in, because it's genuinely remarkable, and it's the reason this case stays with you. A woman was murdered at a park in 1987. For 37 years, there was no answer. The man responsible lived out his entire life, died of natural causes in another state, and was buried, presumably believing, if he thought about it at all, that whatever he'd done in Ohio in 1987 had died with the passage of time. He was wrong, because decades later, investigators who had never given up on Janice Christensen were willing to cross the country, obtain a court's permission, and reach into a grave to pull the truth out of it. That is what it looks like when a system refuses to let a case go. Death is a wall that stops a lot of things. It stops a trial, it stops a punishment. But it turns out that death is no longer a wall that stops identification. Thomas Jordan's own body, exhumed from an Arizona cemetery, gave up the final proof. And the testing did exactly what investigators hoped. The DNA obtained from Jordan's exhumed remains confirmed the link, definitively tying him to the assault of the teenager in Cuyahoga Falls and to the murder of Janice Christensen in Hudson Township. On August 8, 2024, the Ohio Attorney General, Dave Yost, together with the Hudson and Cuyahoga Falls police chiefs, announced it publicly. After 37 years, the cases were solved. The man who killed Janice Christensen had a name. Investigators had reached past the grave to find it. So who was Thomas Collier Jordan? The record that investigators assembled describes a lifelong, escalating criminal, the kind of repeat violent offender whose entire history, laid out in a line, reads like a warning that went unheeded for decades. His convictions stretched back to the 1950s. He was sentenced in 1959 for grand larceny, in 1961 for burglary, in 1972 for malicious entry, and then, in 1976, the conviction that matters most: rape, stabbing, and burglary, a violent sexual assault with a knife, for which he was imprisoned until 1985. That's the pattern the 1987 crimes fit into so precisely. A man convicted of raping and stabbing, released in 1985, and then, 2 years later, linked by DNA to a knife-point rape and a stabbing murder in the same corner of Ohio. Investigators also noted that Jordan had ties to a whole string of states over his life: Arizona, Nevada, California, Louisiana, Michigan, the geographic footprint of a drifter with a long reach. And that fact carries a chilling implication that the BCI stated openly. Given his extensive history and his mobility, Thomas Jordan is believed to have committed additional sexual assaults, in Ohio and quite possibly elsewhere, that have not yet been connected to him. Which is why the Ohio authorities did something important with this solved case. They didn't just close it and move on. They shared Jordan's DNA profile and his information with law enforcement nationwide, precisely because a man like this, mobile, violent, active across decades and state lines, may well be the unknown answer to other cold cases sitting in other files, in other states, right now. The identification of Janice Christensen's killer may turn out to be not an ending but a key, one that unlocks the truth for other victims and other families who are still, at this moment, waiting for their own answer. A dead man's exhumed DNA, entered into the national conversation, may still be solving crimes for years to come. Janice Christensen's case teaches 3 things, and I want to name them clearly, because each one is worth carrying with you. The first is about the survivor, the teenager attacked 2 months before Janice died. I want to say this as plainly as I can. Her courage solved a murder. It was the DNA evidence from her assault, evidence that existed only because she found the strength to report what happened and let it be collected, that was retested in 2022 and produced the CODIS hit that named Thomas Jordan. Without her coming forward at 17, in 1987, when it would have been so much easier to stay silent, Janice Christensen's murder might never have been solved. Survivors are not footnotes to the crimes committed against them. Sometimes, as here, a survivor's decision to speak becomes the very thing that delivers justice, not only for herself, but for someone she never met. If you take one thing from this episode, let it be that. The second is about the reach of modern forensics and the extraordinary lengths investigators will go to. This case did not end with a convenient database match to a living suspect they could arrest. It ended with agents crossing 2,000 miles and exhuming a body from an Arizona grave to be certain. That is a profound statement about the seriousness with which these cold cases are now being pursued, and about a new reality, that death no longer guarantees anonymity. A killer can die peacefully, of old age, and be buried, and still be identified and named years later. The grave is no longer a hiding place. And the third is the honest limit, which I won't dress up. Thomas Jordan is dead. There will be no trial, no verdict, no sentence, no confrontation in a courtroom. He escaped, in the most literal sense, the earthly justice he deserved. He died free, of natural causes, an old man. The resolution here is not punishment. It is truth. It is a name, a certainty, and an answer delivered to the people who loved Janice Christensen after 37 years of not knowing. That is not everything a family might want, but it is not nothing, either. For many people who have waited that long, the truth itself, finally knowing who, and being certain, is its own kind of justice, the only kind still available in a case like this. And these investigators reached into a grave to make sure the family got at least that. Let me end with the people, because in the end they're the only reason any of this matters. Janice Christensen was 30 years old. She went to a park on a summer morning in 1987 to be outdoors, and she did not come home. That's the whole terrible shape of it. A woman doing something as ordinary and life-affirming as taking herself to a bike path, and a violent stranger ending everything she was and everything she would have become. 37 years is a long time for the people who loved her to carry that with no answer. Children grew up. Parents likely passed. A generation lived its whole span under the shadow of a question. And then, at last, the question was answered. Not because the killer confessed, not because a witness came forward, but because the science finally caught up, and because investigators cared enough to chase the truth across the country and into a grave. But the person I keep thinking about, at the end of this one, is the survivor. A 17-year-old girl, attacked in a park in the summer of 1987, who lived and who found the courage to report it and to let the evidence be kept. She could not have known, at 17, that the brave thing she was doing in the worst moment of her life would reach forward 35 years and give a murdered woman's family their answer. She was not thinking about that. She was just surviving and doing the hard, right thing in front of her. And it turned out to matter more than she could ever have imagined. There is something in that worth holding on to. The idea that courage, even courage that seems to lead nowhere at the time, can echo down the years and become the thing that finally sets the truth free. Two women, connected by the worst kind of coincidence and by a pair of shoelaces. One survived to hold the key. One did not. Say her name, Janice Christensen. After 37 years, her family knows. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.